Welcome to the General's Gentlemen.
Hello, welcome back to the RTS podcast. The Avengers have assembled once again. We've finally made it here. So hello to everyone. Hello to Kevin, Topher, and Brandon. How are we?
Andy.
Doing well.
Good.
Glad to be here.
Yep. So today we're going to be talking about early game in RTS games, and we also kind of by coincidence we'll be talking about some Co 3 because recently that was announced and some of us have had a playthrough of it. So to start off with, Brandon on his blog Wayward Strategy wrote about what he thinks makes a good early game, and we've all read it and we have our thoughts. So how about, Brandon, do you want to give us the thesis of your article and we'll go from there?
Sure. And honestly, usually what I do when I write is I just kind of throw a bunch of ideas out there and see if anyone has any thoughts about them. But I've noticed that people seem to react better if I write it like I'm actually presenting an argument. So the argument that I was basically presenting is based on my experience. The early game period is one of the hardest things to get right in RTS. I feel like the rushes and even some kinds of cheese are essential because a more diverse game with more things that can happen keeps people's interests longer. But a lot of people don't like that. And also I'd noticed in games like Legacy of the Void and several other more recent RTS, like there in Grey Goo, one of the community leaders who goes by Xset, he created a mod called QuickScript, and literally all it does is right at the beginning of the game when you build your first refinery, it refunds the cost of the refinery. And everyone, and now there's only like 30, 40 people that play the game right now, but basically everyone that's playing it competitively plays that because it's faster. So I guess to stop rambling, one of my contentions is that truncating the early game, keeping it short, muted myself there, getting people out of the early game quickly seems to be one good way to reduce the pain of the early game.
You keep muting yourself.
Myself again. What happens in the early game is because of the way RTS economies scale, losing something early is worse than losing it later because you have less stuff, you have less income, so that can be a snowball, a literal snowball effect, where you're pushing your economy up the hill, and all of a sudden you've got a bigger hill to climb than your opponent because of something they did, and the game just falls apart. So when I'm thinking about RTS design, I try to think of stability. I try to think of from a starting place of what I think of as homeostasis. You have this game state that's hard to really permanently tip one way or the other, and the mid game is kind of the pinnacle of that. Both players have a lot of options. Both players are kind of at the peak of their ability to do things usually, and that's a really fun time for most people in most RTS, and it seemed to me that getting people into that faster was a starting point for a way to create a good early game experience. It's basically to get it over with as soon as possible. Now, that being said, I do think there are games like Age of Empires and Company of Heroes that kind of go the other way, and they overly elongate the early game, try to make that curve, instead of really steep, try to make it shallower. And I think that can work too, but to me, the safer starting point seems to be to try to get people's economy kind of up off the ground. I think actually Command and Conquer kind of does the same thing. They start you off with a ton of money, and that can let you really rush to tech or boom your economy or build some defenses or kind of do a mix of both. And to me, the problem there is that you can get out of the early game really quick in Command and Conquer, but you can have a flame tank in your base in 2 minutes. The games.
I'm sure it's sooner than that. In 0 hour,
Yeah,
I'm sure it's like a minute.
yeah, like 58 seconds or something, or a minute 23 or something, um, and that I think is kind of another problem with early games is in the article what I tried to talk about is kind of the rate at which your economy ramps up versus the rate at which game-ending damage can cross the map, versus your ability to kind of see that incoming damage. Um, and one of the things I had said is something like a scouting option, like you get a dedicated scout, like you get in the Age of Empires games, most of them anyway, that can help because that kind of reminds the player they should be scouting. In StarCraft, it's not really intuitive. You don't want to take a worker off the line and move it out across the map because he's supposed to be working. It's counterintuitive to take a harvester and to go scout with him. So something like a dedicated scout makes sense to me because besides the fact that it's got nothing else to be doing besides moving around the map, it's literally a thing that's sitting there. The player sees it. Oh yeah, I should see what my opponent's doing. So those are just kind of some of the things I was kind of playing around with in that article.
Okay, what do we think?
Yeah, I can jump in. I found it really interesting, and just a little background about me. Like, I'm a game designer, but not an RTS game designer. I'm an RTS like casual player, I would say, and an RTS like fan. I mean, I used to watch tons of StarCraft. Like, I still watch a little bit. So I'm always gonna come at it from like a little bit of a game design perspective, but from like a casual player. I'm not super hardcore. And something that was really interesting to me that jumped out was talking about like the different maps and how like maps are so important, at least in like StarCraft games in particular. And I'm sure it's really important in other RTSs as well. But I'm just wondering what you think about the relative importance of a map for a game as it relates to scouting and as it relates to build order as well. So like, let's not even talk about different factions or different races. Like, and I just remember when I was laddering back in the day in StarCraft 2, there were a couple maps where if you were spawned in close position, literally every time everyone would just rush you. Like they would hit you with crazy early pressure. Like I think it was an 8 pool or 9 pool or something, or like super early racks, and you just die. Like the cheese was overpowering there, so that kind of broke the early game. So you really need to have that like delicate balance between early aggression being powerful, but not just like completely breaking the game. So I remember what they did, and this dates me as well, for the MLG tournaments, they would make like a different version of the map that actually prohibited close position spawn. So it always had to be cross spawn. So I think it was like Metalopolis was a map, and like Shattered Temple or something like that, which is a variant of Lost Templar. Anyways, but they had to like create new versions of the maps that would prohibit those close position spawning. So just curious what you guys thought about the relative importance of the map based on which particular RTS game that you're talking about.
Yeah, also game mode I think is relevant. Is like a 4v4 is very different to 1 versus 1 in terms of map sizes. So naturally those things are linked.
Mm-hmm. And I definitely think it's an interesting topic in terms of like map design, because if you look at RNG created maps or seed maps, like in Age of Empires, I realize that professionals play on created maps that are very specifically designed, but the average player who just plays will play on a map that's totally random, and the same with a game like Tooth and Tail. And so having that scouting unit really helps, because the map could be completely random, whereas a game like StarCraft or any of the Blizzard games that are very rigidly designed maps, I think it has a big impact because you generally know where your opponent's going to be. You know how far away or how close they're going to be. You know what resources they're going to be near. In Age of Empires, you're not always equally distant to certain resources that you may need or don't need, and so I think the more rigid maps will have a big difference in terms of versus the more randomly generated maps. And so that's just my thought on that side of it.
I think.
No, go ahead. I've talked enough so far.
I think part of what Brandon said in his article, and then what Kevin was getting at, is that there's much of a Goldilocks zone. There's like a sweet spot where you don't want rushes to be impossible, because then the first 5 minutes is you just doing the identical thing over and over again. Like, that's one criticism that Age of Empires gets, is that the feudal age, the Stone Age, whatever the first non-combat phase is that you are just optimizing and repeating the exact same thing, and it can be kind of boring. But then also a lot of people like enjoy that. A lot of people like the slower pace. So I think it depends on what sort of player you are, like what skill level it is, just your preference in RTS games generally. But I think StarCraft is an interesting game to talk about because it has changed. And Legacy was the first one. Wings of Liberty, the rushes were much more brutal. It was like StarCraft Brood War, where you would start with a lot less workers, and so it would take you a lot longer to build up, and so you were more vulnerable to being rushed. And because you had less workers, it meant that pulling a worker to scout at the start was 1/6 of your income, whereas in Legacy of the Void you start with like 10 or something, and so it really doesn't matter that much. And so I think Blizzard came to the same conclusion that old mate Kevin here did, is that like getting rushed so early on like that is not fun, and it's too cheesy and it's obnoxious. And so when Legacy of the Void came out, they deliberately shifted, well, I don't know, what would you call it? They delayed they speeded up, I guess. They speeded up the early game so that you get to the mid game quicker, so that the cheese is less punishing.
Actually, Tim Morton, who was the producer on Legacy of the Void, who's now with a different studio, he's been talking a lot about what he looks for when designing an early game, and that's something he actually brought up, was when they compressed the early game for Legacy of the Void, they did so because it still allowed for rushes. There's still tons of rushes and cheese and things like that, but it made it less impactful if you make a small error. It doesn't completely cripple you, but it also still allows for flexibility in offense and defense, and I found that really interesting because it's less, cutthroat, but it still is like that Goldilocks zone you were talking about.
Yeah, I think another also comparison point is between 0 Hour and Command and Conquer 3, because you have both flame tanks in those games that can basically burn your base down in 30 seconds if you're not paying attention. But it's very different in CNC3 because there's actually a tech building that unlocks the flame tank, the command center or whatever it is, like the tier 2 structure. And so when you're playing CNC3, you can scout with infantry and you can see that building and you go, uh-oh, he's going to rush a flame tank, because there's really no reason to rush it that early. And so you're scouting for that, as opposed to scouting for, like, if they have one harvester, then they're probably going to be going attack bikes. So there's different cheeses that they can do, but they're all pretty easy to scout. Whereas in 0 Hour, you really can't scout it that well. You scout it when you see the flame tank is halfway towards your base already. And so you have a lot less time to react and less opportunity to see it coming.
Yeah, and one of the things that I like about the Command and Conquer games, especially 3 and Red Alert, is earlier, and this actually goes back to what Kevin was saying too, as far as map design goes. So what I look for in the early game is what I, in my own little, kind of self-invented lexicon, I term stability. I talked earlier very briefly about what I call homeostasis, and that's kind of the idea, is that a stable early game is one where you don't have that. I was going to say you don't have that fear of losing, but you really should, have a fear of losing. But in Command and Conquer, when you get something across the map, like a flame tank or an APC with an engineer inside of it, the only real thing that you can absolutely end the game with in the early game with Command and Conquer is if you get their Conyard. And if you get that flame tank in the base, the other player could respond by selling their buildings off. So they get at least some of that money back, and they can use it to do something else. So I think that's one of the strengths, actually, of Command and Conquer, is that stuff dies really easily, but you have all these tools to kind of fiddle around with it on the back end, and everything is so high impact that, I can get one flame tank in and kill, 3 or 4 of his buildings. But he can get one thing in my base and make it even again. Um, but anyway, what I was gonna say is, getting some Zerglings inside your opponent's base. Everyone blocks off their base in StarCraft 2 because they know there's all these things that can get in your base, and you get 2, 3, 5, a second, and then you're just done. Your economy's gone. And that's it. There's no real. You can't sell a building back unless it's a bunker, and it doesn't really count. So to me, in some ways, the early game in StarCraft 2 is more fragile. So they have to design the maps this carefully because of all of the crazy things that otherwise could happen. So they need to give the player the map as a tool to help defend against those things. And thinking about it as kind of an agnostic way, as a designer, thinking about it without saying, okay, well, Banshee's this and Mutalisk's that and Zergling's this. One thing I like, just change direction slightly, about Company of Heroes 2 is the game-ending damage doesn't come out for 10 minutes, 8 minutes, because you need a tank to go destroy their base. Otherwise, you have to try to win via the command points, via the victory points. So you can get your army wiped out. You can trap someone. I've seen that a handful of times, someone being trapped in their base. But because of the way that manpower scales and because of the again, some of the high impact stuff that can happen in Company of Heroes 2, or I guess any of the Company of Heroes games, you can't really kill the other player until later in the game when the tanks come out. And those things, to me, so long as there's room to definitively, close out a game, some of those things seem friendlier to the player on the losing end. I've lost all my guys, but I get that manpower bonus, so I can kind of try to come back into it if I'm careful. I got a flame tank or a shadow strike team in my base, but I can sell my buildings and build something else to try to recover it. That's actually, I've been watching and trying to cast some competitive Command & Conquer 3 lately, and one of the most fun things about that, to me, literally fun, is a player will be put on the back foot and they'll tech really hard into infantry, especially if they're Nod, and then they'll just go crazy with an infantry army, and then they'll kind of get back into the game and they'll tech switch into something else, and you actually see these really huge switches to the strategy really quickly, and I think that's fun. There's a lot of RTS I feel like you kind of lock into the strategy until kind of the late mid game, and then you can I'm Protoss, so I'm going air, and air is my thing until I'm in the later game, and then I can expand into the Robo and try to tech up. But with Command & Conquer 3, this isn't working, sell that off, build this. 3 buildings later, I've got a new strategy. And to me, I think that's kind of durable, because you see something's working and you can actually switch out of it and try to do something else. Now, possibly some of these games are what they would consider mid-level. The Command & Conquer 3 communities, I think, kind of smaller than it was a couple of years ago. I remember looking at it back in maybe 2018, and I felt like there were a lot of players online, and now it's the community seems to have shrunk. But anyway, I kind of went 4 different places there when I was talking, so I apologize for that.
I wanted to jump on one thing that you were talking about, that sort of transition from early to mid game. Something that's really nice that I like about Company of Heroes 2. I'm a big fan as well. And this is true of all RTS games, is that when you have less units to control, you can micro them a lot better. You get a lot more value out of them. So that early game is really sort of babysitting maybe 2, 3, 4 units across the map, making sure that they're in the correct cover, making sure that they have the correct arc, if it's a machine gun or crew weapon or whatever. The same is true for StarCraft and other RTS. Because you have less units, you can be more efficient with them. And then as you sort of transition out of that early game, when you have your build orders and your strategies and stuff, then you start having this diminishing returns, because you can't control all the units as efficiently as you can a smaller group of units. I think that's such an elegant design for RTS games as a whole. And sort of that whole phase of starting up, you have a plan, you haven't done your scouting yet, so you have your initial like strategy. Maybe I'm gonna invest more into my economy. Maybe I'm gonna invest more into expanding. Maybe I'm gonna invest more into technology, whatever. You make like one or two of those choices. Then you start to scout, you start to see what the other player is doing. Maybe you need to adjust your strategy a little bit. And that like really smooth transition, as long as you have a nice stable early game and like mid game transition into the mid game to late game. It's like that's what makes RTS so like elegant to me.
I actually really like the way you phrase that. In terms of like the early game, like I think a smooth early game, most of your early decisions should be made before the game. Like, oh, I'm going to try to do this, build these units, or go for this strategy. And then once you get your economy going, you should either have a free scouting unit, like if it's Ancient Empires, or like a Reaper or an Adept in Legacy of the Void, that what gives you something to spend your attention on until there's bigger decisions to be made, like, oh, my opponent's going for this, so I need to adjust, or what those mid-game decisions you need to make. And so I really like the micro dance you talk about, and then also the decision making that goes on before the game starts and then early in the early game as well.
Yeah, just a random little point I want to throw out about Company of Heroes is like losing squads in the early game could be considered more forgiving than the late game because you're losing a Vet 0 Grenadier. It's not like without an upgrade, and so it sucks in the early game, but the veterancy is an interesting way of making early game losses less punishing. I think changing course a little bit, I think also what's really important in RTS early games is like you said, Topher, to have something to give your attention to. I think that's worth expanding a bit, because it can be really boring if the early game is just you watching things happen. Like if you queue something up and then you're just there for 15 seconds, and then you do something, and then the next 15 seconds you're kind of just waiting, not really doing anything. And so some level of like precision is nice. So whether that's controlling a scout unit, queuing up workers every 12, 17 seconds, on top of building supply depots, on top of moving your unit around. You need to have something to take your attention up. You don't want it to be too much. I think you want to be warming up for the actual game, but just something to keep you occupied. I think prevents it from being boring.
And it's funny, different games have different elements that keep you occupied. Like, again, I'm going back to StarCraft 1 originally. In that first 5 minutes of the game, you're microing your workers to individual mineral patches, and there's like a dance of, there's like a front row of minerals and a back row of minerals, and you're making sure you're prioritizing. Like, as a player, I don't find that super interesting, and as like a spectator, I don't find it super interesting myself. But that's, for those people, that level of precision is really attractive to them, and that's why like these super hardcore Brood War players play at a level that's like not accessible by a normal human being. Like, these people are crazy. But yeah, it's like, what do you want the player to be paying attention to? And to me, I think Company of Heroes does a really good job at that. Whether you're like garrison buildings or like constructing, you can build the sandbags or tank traps in like defensive or cover positions. I think that's really interesting. I think that's a lot more interesting than like microing your workers to mineral patches, personally.
Yes. What I also love about Company of Heroes is, you'll be capturing points and it'll be kind of chill, and then all of a sudden on the mini map, you can see that the nearby region is flashing red. And you're like, uh-oh, he's capturing that point. And it gives you a bit of a clue that, he's over there. And he's like rushed that point beyond what he normally would cap. And so then you want to like group your units up before attacking, rather than normally you would have just captured with a lone squad of like your engineers. But because you see that he's capturing it, now you want to maybe get like a rifle squad to do it instead. And so, I think even that's a balance, because maybe I'm wrong, but I think in Iron Harvest, like through the fog of war, it tells you what the enemy has captured. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. And
yeah, I don't like
Harvest,
that at all.
Whenever a point is captured, it shows on the minimap.
Yeah, I think it's much better in Company of Heroes, where it's only if it's like an adjacent point that you can see.
I think in Company of Heroes, your units have to be able to see into that zone, right?
Yes.
So it's just like if you can physically see the zone, then you can see that it's being captured.
Yeah, like you don't
I
have to see
agree.
the
I think
flag. You just have to see the little like the region itself.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that does make more sense. It still preserves that sense of anonymity, so you can't really tell what your opponent's doing, because with Iron Harvest, it's a lot more perfect information. You can see, okay, he's capturing this one, that one. I can watch him as he captures the points closer and closer. Um, but going back to something, I'm actually glad that StarCraft Brood War, StarCraft 1 came up, because I think it was Kevin earlier said something about, because Topher also mentioned that. In one thing that I'm not a huge Brood War guy either, but I think that the fans of that community do have a point where, in Brood War, actively controlling those small groups of units is a necessity, because you can only select 12, 16 units at a time, 12 units at a time. So even in larger fights, you only have those 12 guys at a time that you can manage, and so you can actually win with a smaller force, because the larger force gets inefficient because the player can't control them as well. You actually see something very similar in Command & Conquer Remastered, where units will not move to engage the enemy, so the players actually have to really micro their units really intensively to make sure that they've got all of them into a fight, which I find fun in Command & Conquer Remastered. Now, of course, the challenge for modern RTS design is modern players that aren't Brood War purists aren't going to want that. They're not going to want to say, I can only select 12 guys at a time. No one's going to want to play a game that does that anymore. I have not purchased, I loved StarCraft when I was a kid. I have not purchased StarCraft Remastered because I know I can't go play that again. I know I can't do that, so I would hate it. I never liked that in the Blizzard games. And one challenge, though, in modern RTS that we see a lot is with deathballing, is it becomes to the point that you don't have to micro your units as well when you've got so many, because you just have this big pile of damage walking around. It's getting a little away from talking about the early game, but I just thought that was relevant because we were talking about large army dynamics and why it's more interesting to manage and maintain smaller groups of units. Now, the other kind of part of me, perversely, because I think where a lot of us are Company of Heroes fans, is that's one thing I like about Company of Heroes, is because even a big army in Company of Heroes is literally a small army. You've only got 12, 15, maybe at the most 18 or 20 squads and vehicles to work with, but oftentimes it's less than that, unless you're in a 4v4 or something and you've managed to keep your stuff alive really well. But that's to me, that's a more accessible number of things to deal with, and if you're providing the player with that many tools, then they have more control over the outcome with those tools. So that's kind of my little pitch for smaller scale games and why I appreciate them personally. But yeah, it's I think, and you guys maybe pitch in on this too, I think that's one thing where the Age of Empires games kind of have an advantage over a sci-fi game, is a lot of the DPS in Age of Empires is melee still, so you don't get this death ball that's as devastating, because you've got all of these infantry units that create a line, and the long range units are not the whole army like they would be in a sci-fi game or a modern game.
I have a question. I don't think you've played this, Kevin, but what do you guys think of the creeps in Ashes of the Singularity? I don't know if you played it either, Topher. Have you played it?
I played it a few years ago, and then I played Escalation for a little bit, but I haven't dived too much into that. But I think the design of any type of creep in an RTS has a lot of benefits. I think it really slows down an early game. It does what we kind of talked about, like gives the player something to do. If you feel engaged, like, oh, I'm already in a battle a little bit, or I'm skirmishing, and while not risk, it's pretty hard to lose a game by going after something like that. But at the same time, I think it provides an opportunity to be engaged, to scout, and to be able to not risk everything while still having some fun in the early game.
Just to clarify, is that like creeps from Warcraft 3 or something like that? Like neutral mobs?
It's
So
similar, but there's no experience. Instead, you have to clear them in order to expand resources.
I see.
So they defend little resource regions.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add past what Topher said. But I think it can help kind of pace how you expand and where you expand and when, especially in the very early game, because it slows you down from being able to try to capture a bunch of regions at once, because you've only got a couple units right at the start, so you've got to send those, basically most of them, to one region to take it, and then so once you're past like 1-2 minutes into the game, that opens it up a lot. But in the very early game, it constrains you a little bit to try to keep you focused on like smaller operations.
And can I mention one thing though? Recently, I've been playing. It's a little bit older, but it's called. Hold on, let me pull it up. It's it's called Driftland. It's more. It's a more of a longer RTS game. Usually a match lasts over an hour, but they have very large maps, and you are on islands. So you island hop to get closer to your opponent, and there are creeps called barbarians. And one thing I think that game struggles with is it has very large maps, and then it also has creeps to slow you down even more. And I think RTS can lean too far into the delay mechanics. So you're already far apart from your opponent. You can't get to them quickly, and then you have these neutral creatures that are slowing you down even more. And I think they're. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that sounds like Sins of a Solar Empire to me. We have the pirates that inhabit some territories or some planets in the system, and yeah, I think, as with most things, that it comes down to saying something as trite as there's a balance to it. If you want a game that takes 14 minutes to get across the map the first time, there's games out there that do that. Obviously being a little hyperbolic, but I don't know that many modern audiences, like a large modern audience, would really, really like that.
And that is one thing this struggles with, is it just takes too long to get anything. And I think I thought one thing on this I found interesting is back when in Wings of Liberty in like 2011, I remember playing some ladder games. I was really bad back then in college. I didn't have any time to practice, but there were novice maps for your first 50 games, and there were rocks. You could not be rushed, and so there were rocks that would stop your enemy from getting into your base. You would have a long time before they could get in, before they could do the damage to break down these rocks. And so to ease players in, they made it so that you just couldn't be killed before the 5-minute mark or 6-minute mark. And they don't do that anymore, and there are downsides to it. But I thought that was an interesting design choice to help players not feel pressured.
The air units or Reapers or something. It wasn't very.
Yeah.
And it also teaches you the wrong habits. I don't think that's a good approach.
Yeah, it doesn't teach you to be a better player, but it does lower the stress I felt.
Yeah,
Honestly,
which is important in a way.
Mm-hmm.
As a new player to StarCraft 2, I confess, I did actually like that for a while. Because it did feel safer. It did feel less scary to say, okay, I can't have an army knocking on my door right now. But yeah, unfortunately, in StarCraft, it was an incomplete solution. I think Supreme Commander did something similar. They created a no-rush mode where they painted a circle on the map, and you couldn't move outside that circle for the no-rush time. And people would build their stuff and move their army right to the edge of the circle for when the if their bases circle for when the timer ran out, so they could start attacking. But yeah, I don't personally think that's the right choice. I think
And
more
I
natural.
don't think it was either, but I felt like it should be mentioned.
Yeah, it's interesting, and a lot of people just love no rushes, and a lot of people want to indefinitely play no rush maps, and I think that's fine. They should be able to, like as you know, in my video I talked about this, like the treaty option in Age of Empires. Like I think those things are all good to have in games, in custom games anyway.
Yeah, and before that, I mean, StarCraft 1, you would just declare it. It was like a gentleman's agreement, no rush 5 or no rush 10, and then you get to see how like honorable or bad manner your opponent is, and you get 12 Zerglings in your base. So it's interesting that they sort of took this idea that just sort of spontaneously came out of playing custom games with people, and then like designed the rocks to be in front of the base, or like designed regions of the map that you couldn't occupy until the durations are done. But this kind of brings me to a question that I want to ask you guys is, as a designers, we all think about player experiences, and we want to think about how long these phases of the game last. So like, generally speaking, what are we talking about? Like, is the early to mid game transition, is that after 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes? How long is too long, do you think, for an RTS?
I think seconds and minutes is the wrong way of thinking about it. I think it's more a percentage of total game time. Because the early game in Supreme Commander is going to be very different to the early game in, I don't know, let's say CNC3. You know, a game
Or
that has
Tooth and Tail, which has like a 5-minute
yeah,
game.
Yeah, exactly. Or Command & Conquer Rivals, or you know, whatever is a short game. So, I mean, that being said, I think so what's a standard RTS game is like 15, 20 minutes. Like that's StarCraft, Command & Conquer. And then I think maybe like 2 minutes is like, you shouldn't be able to rush someone in under 2 minutes. I think that sort of is fine. Like I think whatever Legacy of the Void is a good system. You can get proxied, you can get rushed, but it's not like too early. And like in Company of Heroes, I think there's a pretty good sweet spot. You know, because like no one sends a rifleman squad over the other side of the map and tries to attack you. The only exception though is sometimes in like small maps you get the Kubel and the Stern Pioneers. Like that can be really obnoxious because the Kubel can shoot at you and they can just repair it for free with the Stern Pioneer, and then they can just like get your cut off, and like that can be really obnoxious. I think that's definitely not fun at all. But apart from that, I think Co does it well. So it's hard to quantify these things other than just look at the examples where I think it works well.
Yeah, so for me, the three good starting points. Company of Heroes, where, like Topher said, there's really very little incentive to go directly attack the enemy. You want to capture territory. You're actively like moving around the map as opposed to right across it to your opponent. Command and Conquer, where they start you off with a ton of resources, so the early game is kind of more variable. You can go right for tanks. You can go right for economy. You can go for tech. It gives you a lot of options right out of the gate. It can be dangerous because the match length is so variable. Because if I'm trying to go for tech and you're gonna rush me, then I'm probably just going to lose. But I think it's a good starting point. I think Command & Conquer is a really good starting point because it gets you right into the action like a lot of the time. And then like you guys were saying also, Legacy of the Void, where it's aiming for 2 to 3 minutes out of a 15 to 20 minute match. It gives you this kind of kick to get into the mid game. And I think, like I said at the beginning, I think that's the safe way to do it, is to try to push the player into the mid game and make those rush timings really hard and give the player who's potentially going to be rushed an opportunity to try. There's 3 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes is kind of enough time to get across the map to see what your opponent's going to try to throw back across at you. And that's how I look at it. I look at it as, how long does it take your economy to hit this point? How long does it take you to get this thing out that you can go damage your opponent with? And how long does it take you to get a scout across the map? Those three, the inflection point of those three timings is the important thing. If your economy goes slowly, but you can get a scout across the map quickly, and the damage dealing unit is in between those, that's probably okay. The problem is when you can get that damage dealing unit out very quickly, but your economy grows slowly and you have a medium paced scout. That means that it's really easy to get damage across the map before you can get a scout across the map.
Yeah, especially if it's on
kind of three timings together makes it good or bad or in between.
As for the scouting thing, especially on a 4-player map in a 1 versus 1, because sometimes you scout the last base and you see that they're rushing you, but by then it's kind of already too late. So again, even the map can affect the way that spawning works, the scouting works. And something I think also that's worth distinguishing is different types of early game aggression and early game combat. Because CNC3 is a great example where you can fight your opponent within 30 seconds, but what that fighting is it's both of your rifleman squads that are used for scouting shooting each other. So that engagement doesn't really matter. It's just a cheap rifle squad that you've produced by selling like a watchtower. Because when you sell a structure, you get a rifle squad. You sell a base defense. And so you're just fighting over scouting. That's all you're fighting over. That's different to a flame tank coming into your base at 50 seconds. Because if you lose that battle, the flame tank can just kill you. So different.
There still is some interest to it, though, even if there's no. I think you're absolutely right, though. It's not an important fight, but if you lose the fight, then you're that many seconds behind your opponent on scouting, which does matter.
If they're going for flame tank or a bike rush or something like that, especially. Yeah. The other thing too is then on top of that, you also then have the fights for oil derricks, or in CNC3 it's called the Tiberium Spikes. So they give you like a little bit of income that you can capture with engineers. And so you get these really exciting skirmishes where you're not just fighting to kill each other, you're fighting to snipe the lone, slow, weak engineer unit who's trying to capture this structure. And the engineer maybe can like hop in a garrison for protection to buy some time. And so you get all this interesting micro and decisions as well, because you don't want to overcommit to it and then have someone just send attack bikes to kill your harvesters, and so you're incentivizing this combat, but with the stakes are much lower, which I think is a nice way to do it. Like even in StarCraft 2, you have some like really interesting battles where the Reaper is trying to snipe the creep tumors, and that's going to really mess up the Zerg because now they can't expand the creep as well. But you're not going to lose the game just because you lost a creep tumor.
For sure. Yeah. I don't know if they still have Zelnaga watchtowers, but there's always fights over the scouting structures on the map.
Yeah, and I mean, StarCraft 2, it turns out is a pretty well-designed RTS. But yeah, the Protoss has a depth micro to try to, when to shade and when not to, and whether they should go through with it or cancel it. And, if you send 4 Zerglings across, it's not like a commitment for the Zerg, but it lets you, pull back the wounded ones and try to commit with the healthy ones. And it's a very good balance. I think StarCraft 2 does that very well.
Right. Well, okay. So are there any RTS games that we can be mean schoolyard bullies to and identify that we think have a bad early game?
I'm going to be... Sorry, go ahead.
Go on. Oh, I was going to say, well, Brandon already mentioned Grey Goo, which is why they play with a mod that speeds it up a bit.
Yeah, I'm going to be...
Honestly, I'm sorry, I don't need to...
No, go ahead.
Because I know I've had a lot of talking time. Honestly, in Grey Goo, I do commentaries of those on YouTube, and before they started doing the quick script, I would literally skip 4 or 5 minutes in because nothing is going to happen in 90% of cases. Nothing is going to happen in the first almost 7 minutes of the game sometimes. and that is a very bad pacing. So I think the game is better than its reputation, but that was definitely a problem. The early game was too slow, and getting that game started off, literally you just refunding the cost of one building, that was enough. That's why these scales are so important. So it's not even picking on it. It's just showing like one building's cost added to your coffers at the beginning of the match can be a huge difference in terms of the feel of the game. So I don't even think of it as picking on Greg. It was just a really good case study to say this one little tiny change made such a huge difference. But I do think it's fair to say that Command and Conquer, because of all of the different things that can happen so quickly, I feel like almost across the board, they're a little too fragile in the early game. I don't know how I would. I don't know 100% how I would fix that. But I feel like some additional stability in the very early game in Command and Conquer would probably improve it. Like just pick like 3, like CNC 3, because it can feel so bad to have that flame tank sneak in the back and kill half of your buildings in 20 seconds, or a Shadow Strike team. I think those can come out even faster than a flame tank, and they just fly in and they drop in and they just kill a bunch of buildings and run away, and then that can feel kind of bad. But yeah, the CNC is a hard one because it gives you so many tools for defense and offense, and to sell a building if you see it about to be taken or destroyed, and I don't know. It's one of those things that it's really hard to find a good toggle to say this one thing would make it better.
Okay, Typhon.
I'm going to pick on a game that I actually really enjoy, which is Homeworld Deserts of Carrack, because I feel that game has a very narrow and symmetrical opening. You really only have 2 options. You can rush to armored assault or assault ships, or you can just try to spam your basic unit. And because of the similarity in the factions, there are some differences between them, especially with the DLC factions. But I really feel like it just is very. If you gamble on the wrong tech within the first 1 second of what you click on, once you start gathering resources, you could lose the game right away, or it can just be a really boring stalemate for the next 5 minutes, or it can be, it's just not very enjoyable. And I really enjoy the rest of the game, but I find the early game of Deserts of Carrack not very enjoyable.
Kevin, any thoughts?
I can't think of one. Like, I think my repertoire of RTS games is admittedly a lot smaller than your guys. I'm trying to think. The only thing that really jumps to mind is I had played a bit of the follow-up to Total Annihilation was Planetary Annihilation, I think. And the thing that I didn't like about the early game is basically the way that I saw it is there were like 4 paths you could go. There was like the ground base, which is the bots and the vehicles. There's the air base, which is like the plane. You could build boats if the map had water. And then there was like the 4th was like a satellite based or orbital based. And I found that, and I'm a total noob at that game, but if anyone, I couldn't figure out the orbital based units, and people would just come to my planet and like blow up all my shit. It's the fact that the 4 tech trees were so orthologically different from each other.
Whoa, that sounds like a fancy game designer word.
Defend myself, right?
Please define ortho something.
Orthogonal unit differentiation. Orthogonal, thank you. Orthogonal unit differentiation. It's that a unit, no matter how many you have of that unit, can never equal another unit. So the idea is like,
so when you have 5 bats trying to shoot like an air unit or something.
Exactly, like in Age of Empires, you have an archer, and no matter how many archers you have, it can never equal what a transport ship can do. Like, they just do different things. It's not that one is an upgraded version of the other. It's just they fundamentally do different things.
Right.
So in the early game of Planetary Annihilation, you have to choose between these like very bespoke types of units. And for me, being really new to the game, I just struggled with that. And I found it super frustrating that someone could come in with a satellite based unit that could just blow up my base and there's nothing I could do about it without
Yeah.
building that tier. And I found out a little bit later that there's certain air units that can actually go into orbit. There's a little bit of hybrid where there's like crossover, but to me it was super frustrating. You had to choose one of those 4 tracks. And then I guess if you had enough resources, you could then diversify and build like multiple of those tracks. But
That sounds
Yeah,
way too
one-
frustrating because like you already have
it
air
was super
units.
frustrating.
So you might have like bombers that attack you, so you put anti-air.
Yeah.
But then on top of anti-air, you need like anti-space. Like that sounds way
Yeah,
too
that
stressful.
was a thing. Yeah, you would have to build special detectors to even see into the orbital layer, and then you would have to build. You had stationary anti-orbital, like towers that could shoot into the orbit. Into orbit. I don't think many units that weren't orbital could fire on orbital options. And on a one planet system in PA in Planetary Annihilation, you could actually use orbital tech. One of my some of my proudest wins were on a massive water and ground planet, building a single orbital laser and sneaking it over the enemy commander and sniping him with the orbital laser. I loved doing that because they never expected it. You know, because you're fighting with the bombers and you're fighting with ships and you're fighting with units, and then there's this one thing that comes up in orbit and just goes.
Yeah,
Maybe
it
that's
sounds
more
bad.
a comment on the design of the game, but it's sort of like at the beginning, the very early phase, you sort of have to choose which one you go. And I guess, yeah, you can diversify. But I was the player that you blew up with that orbital laser. That was always me. And it might feel awesome for you, but it's super frustrating.
Yeah, well, the one big issue with PA was moving from planet to planet. Once you go to a planet, I mean, like, one of the more common systems was a planet with a moon, and both players would spawn on the planet. If somebody could get to the moon first and start building there, if the other player didn't go right away, that moon became almost uncrackable. Because there's just no place to land on the moon where you can establish a beachhead to expand out. So that happened a lot. Players would go just fortify the moon and then just build up and shoot nukes at you or something, which, like you said, it's not a great experience. I just felt like there's just not quite enough counterplay. I think I remember someone had done a mod where they introduced spaceships, which seemed like a good thing to add, because there were very few things that could reliably get units onto a fortified other planet, which I don't think was great.
Any final thoughts, Topher, before you head off?
No, just thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it, and enjoy the rest of your evening, guys. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You're
Good seeing
bailing
you
now,
again.
right? Yep, cool. Okay, we're still going for a bit. We can talk about some Company Heroes 3. I just have to change my overlay. I did prepare this in advance. That one. Okay. Continue ranting about something while I adjust the overlay. One moment.
I don't know. I really wanted to say something about active aggression, but the early game wasn't too remarkable in that game, so probably not a good one to pick on in this case. I do remember, and this is I wish I'd had a chance to think about it more. In Dawn of War 2, the early game is much more fragile than in Company of Heroes. I think it might have to do with the hero units, but I remember basically, like, I played it when it was new, and then I left, and then I came back for Retribution a little bit, and you could literally lose in the first 2 minutes by losing a squad. You feed a squad to the enemy hero, you might as well just quit. And thinking about that in contrast to Company of Heroes 2, which is much more resilient, I guess, in case of the except for the case of the Kubel wagon. Since the two games share so much of the same DNA, it makes me want to stop and
I think melee is
figure
important.
out what Dawn of War.
Because melee was very punishing. So, because in Company of Heroes, when you retreat, you take like a third damage or accuracy. In melee, you take bonus damage. The idea being that you're punished for retreating out of melee combat. And what that meant was that if you retreat late, you can just lose a squad, and especially if you have two melee squads. Like if it's an orc squad versus a tyrannid squad. There's a bit of chicken where no one wants to retreat, so then like it reaches a certain point where like we're fighting to the death because we can't retreat. So I think Dawn of War 2 was, yes, it was very, very brutal. And I actually think Dawn of War 3 did the early game better. I think Dawn of War 3, the early game was where the game shined the most. The late game, it got worse and worse. The scale got too big.
You're absolutely right. Dawn of War 3, the mid game, like anywhere past the mid game, once you started getting to the super elites,
the escalation system as well was terrible.
The which system?
So in Dawn of War 3, as the game would progress, not only would you get more resource income because of your investment.
Oh, the escalate. You said the escalation.
Just arbitrarily, just Okay, we've hit the 10-minute mark. Just kidding. Now you have twice as much resources, which is like exponentially increasing off of the fact that you have more resource regions anyway.
But I agree with you guys. I always found the Dawn of War 3, like early to mid game, really interesting because you're doing a bunch of different things at once that you're building up structures in your base, like maybe you're creating tech structures or military structures, whatever. You're capturing those command points, and you're also like building and upgrading listening stations, I think they're called.
Listening posts.
Which is way more interesting than building caches in Company of Heroes 2.
Yeah.
Because like you choose between munitions and oil, and that's it. It just sits there. In Dawn of War 3, you can like upgrade it. I think there's 2 or 3 tiers. I didn't fully understand the resources, but there's like the blue crystals and the yellow energy and the purple elite resources and stuff. So it always felt like there was something to do. You're always like defending your own listening stations. You're always attacking like enemy listening stations.
Yeah.
It always felt really interesting.
There was like, you could hide in those bushes. There was cover spots. So there was a fair bit of tactics. Also, I think the other thing, the big part of it too was you actually had a lot of options. Because if you're playing Space Marines, you could just spam a bunch of the tactical Marines from your HQ, or you could go for scouts, you could go for snipers, you could go for assault Marines, you could go for the Devastator heavy bolters. So you had a lot of options. Whereas when I play Company of Heroes 2, if I'm playing US, I'm building 3 riflemen every single game. I am never not building 3 riflemen. Or I guess maybe I'll go engineers, like assault engineers. But anyway, and if I'm going... let's say OKW, I will always build like 3 Volks. Like you don't really have a choice. And Dawn of War 2 was the same thing. When you're playing Space Marines, there's an optimal build. You just go like next scout, tactical marine, upgrade your power, whatever. So
also,
yeah, Dawn of War 3 did it well.
Yeah, in Dawn of War 3, I thought also the first upgrade you get on one of your units was really important. So I think the Space Marines could get like a plasma weapon. So if you were fighting against light armor, you'd want to get like the plasma pistol.
The flame for light.
I think
for heavy.
Wasn't there like the assault marines could get like an upgraded power sword or something? Like that first upgrade felt really impactful to me because you would always sort of like you only had enough resources to choose one, and like, am I going to go anti-armor? Am I going to buff up my melee guys? Am I going to start upgrading like my resources? Yeah, Dawn of War 3 was cool. I think it got hammered unfairly.
I don't think it got hammered unfairly. I think it got hammered very fairly. As someone who hammered it a lot, I think there were a lot of things that it did wrong, and the things that it did wrong weighed out the things that it did well. But there were things that it did well.
Yeah, I think that some of the criticisms against Dawn of War 3 were misplaced. The big ones were the lack of retreat, the honestly reversion to Dawn of War 1 style cover. So the big complaints that I remember were, I mean, clearly the super elites I think were a problem. But the what people would call the MOBA style win condition, I thought the only big issue with it was that it was overcomplicated. You have to kill the one thing and the other thing can shoot at you, and then you defeat the last thing in the base. The locations of some of those on the map I didn't like, and the fact that it was this kind of specifically 3-tier system. Like if you had just a bunch of pylons on the map, and once all of the, or like towers, and once all the towers were dead, you lose, I would have been fine with that. Like, just you have to protect these things, and then the fewer of them you have, the easier it is to protect them, and when they're all gone, you lose. But anyway, I think that
I don't want to go down the Dawn of War 3 rabbit hole. We do this like every single time we manage to talk about Dawn of War 3. I have some thoughts about.
I didn't bring it up this time.
Yeah,
though.
that's true.
That's me.
Yeah.
Responsibility. For
It was
that one.
relevant though. Yeah, again, I do think it had a good early game. Dawn of War 2, I think you're right. It is too punishing. So as for games that I think doesn't do the early game well, we've all kind of picked on games that we ourselves love, and I'm going to pick on 0 Hour. And I mentioned why it's just it happens too quickly. Like again, you can rush someone in like 50 seconds with a flame tank, and I like the early aggression, but it's just a little bit too fast. And especially in 0 Hour, what happens is everyone sells their command center to get an extra $1,000. And so that further makes it more lethal. But then you play without a radar because you have no command center. It just completely, was not intended clearly by the designers to sell your command center at the start of the game. And it's not just flame tanks. It's also like your workers are very exposed. You can, if you're playing with a total noob, what you can do is you can build a technical, just like a little Jeep thing, and then you can send it. If your opponent has a GLA, if they're playing GLA, you can run over their workers, like instantly, and so you can just kill all of their workers, in like 45 seconds with a little Jeep, and they have no income anymore. And so basically, in order to play GLA, you have to wall off your buildings, you have to build your barracks, you have to build your war factory in a way that's blocking off your workers, and that's cool. Like I like when base building is meaningful and important, but again, it's just too lethal, too punishing. I think CNC3 does it better. The tech structure for the flame tank, for example. So that I think the other thing is too that I brought up the creeps in Ashes. I personally don't like the creeps in Ashes, and I think creeps can work very well. I don't have anything against it. There's a lot of benefits to it. But the thing is with Ashes, is it's a pretty slow game in terms of the unit speed. Units move pretty slowly, and so even if there aren't creeps, you still can't really attack your opponent that early on. And so I think the creep system was kind of unnecessary. It just extended out the early game, and it meant that because normally in an RTS game you have like this triangle of rush, turtle, expand, or economy. And you have this sort of, you got to scout to see what your opponent's doing. Are they greedy expanding? Are they like rushing? Are they like turtling up? And each one counters the other. Like a rush counters expand counters turtle, and what have you. But then in Ashes, it means that the first 2 minutes of the game is the same. It's like the feudal age in Age of Empires, is you just do the same thing every game. And then like once you hit a certain point where, okay, I've cleared out the creeps, now I can actually play a multiplayer game. I can actually interact with my opponent. That's where it gets a lot more interesting. And if Ashes had really fast units and you could rush your opponent, in the way that you could in Command and Conquer, then having creeps as a barrier to that might be an interesting way of keeping it at a more sensible level. But I think in Ashes, I just never really enjoyed it. And I did play like a few games with the creeps turned off, and I thought it was a lot more interesting. There's more to think about and more to do.
Sense. I guess I played a good amount of Ashes, but I never really played it against other people.
Right.
So in a single player game, as a single player thing, it felt fine. But I see what you're saying about overly slowing it down, because
It's already
armies
slow.
in you, there's
Yeah.
nothing fast. Yeah.
Yeah, apart from like air units.
Right.
We have like
And there
scout
was-
units.
I think there were
yeah.
some.
But
There
they
were
don't have
some
much damage
maps
anyway.
maybe that weren't from escalation, but some maps from the base game that kind of started you on like a U-shaped map, so you could have. There's a shorter air rush distance.
Yeah. There were small maps, but anyway. Okay, let's talk about Co3 before we run out of time.
Okay, let's do that.
So, who wants to start? Kevin, you said you played it a lot. What do you think?
Yeah, well, a lot relatively. I installed it the other day. I played, I want to say like 3 or 4 hours of the main campaign, which I thought was amazing. So I acknowledge it's a technical alpha, right? So performance is kind of garbage. There's some like placeholder icons, whatever. I can see like designers, people who are in the industry can see through all of these things. Like they don't even exist to me. I see a big purple cube moving around the battlefield that says this is a temporary art asset. I don't see that. I see a tank. Like I don't get hung up on those sort of things. But as a fan of, let's say, the Total War series, this is to me sort of like a Total War, an homage to Total War games, and they've done their own sort of twist on it, which I think is really interesting. So I'm curious to see how everything plays out, but my first impressions, I think it's really cool. I like the tactical pause. I don't know exactly how functional it's going to be in an actual big battle when you have maybe, let's say, 5 or 7 squads of infantry against 5 or 7 squads of infantry with vehicle support. Obviously, when there's that many variables, you can't really plan with a huge amount of precision what your tactics are. And this makes me like think back to a game called Frozen Synapse. I don't know if you guys have played that. It's sort of like a turn-based tactical. How do I say? It's like a 5v5. It's sort of like Rainbow Six Siege. There's like 5 versus 5, and you give them actions per turn. So I want my troop to go here, hide behind the corner. I want my sniper to aim through the window. I want my demolition man to throw a grenade here. So I perform my actions. The other person scripts their actions for their turn, and it goes back and forth. And obviously, you can't predict exactly what the other person's going to do, and all these emergent gameplay elements happen. But thinking about tactical pause in context of Company of Heroes 3, I think it's going to be the same thing. So it's not going to be super, super useful. I think it's a really nice tool to have. I think overall, there seems to be a ton of progression in the game, which is really nice. I love action RPGs, and my design experience is mostly in action RPGs, so I love progression. And it looks like for your, I think they're called divisions or sections, you can level up passive traits, you can unlock new units, and you can unlock upgrades like commander abilities, like call-in abilities. And each of those abilities, you get a choice between 2 different things. So there's a huge amount of customization, huge amounts of progression. Some of it is still locked. It'll say this is not available in the alpha, which is fine. Obviously, it's still in progress, work in progress. But I was really blown away by how much content there actually is. Lots of units, lots of progression. It's still super janky. The movement phase, the way that there's 3 little star icons that indicate how much movement you have for your units, but it's super janky. If you go 2.5 stars, it sometimes counts as 3 stars. Interacting with objects on the world map is super janky. You'll see a crate of fuel, and certain units just can't pick it up because they get stuck on geometry. So there's a lot of little things, but overall, I think it's great. I really enjoyed my experience so far.
The biggest negative point so far was in the tutorial for the world map. It told me to move somewhere, and it wouldn't let me move there. But it was okay if I was like 1 cell to the left, so I just did that instead. But so I'm okay with Total War. I think that in the Total War games, neither the tactical layer nor the map layer give me as much as I would want in either case, but the combination of those things is good. But coming from Company of Heroes 2, Ardennes Assault was one of my favorite, all-time favorite RTS single-player experiences, and looking at it that way, as an expansion, as an expanded version of what they did in Ardennes Assault, I think you're absolutely right, though. I think it's definitely very Total War-like. It's just without the parts of Total War that I don't like the building up of cities and the almost pointless diplomacy panel. It's just moving around and finding what to fight, and then upgrading your battle groups. But looking at it as a combination of those 2 things, I'm happy with it. From a perspective of the actual gameplay, I really am absolutely fine with everything. We were talking about Dawn of War 3 earlier, and one of the key takeaways from that is each Dawn of War game, all three of them are very, very different from one another. They share, comparing Dawn of War 3 to Dawn of War 2 and StarCraft, I mean, it's clearly closer to Dawn of War 2, but each of the Dawn of War games has a very, very different gameplay model. Company of Heroes 3, Company of Heroes 2, and Company of Heroes 1, they don't have that many big deltas between them. And I think that's good. It might be playing it safe a little bit, but I want Company of Heroes. I sit down, I played Company of Heroes 3, I got Company of Heroes. I was very happy. I liked the American faction. The base structure tents looked great. One thing that I haven't seen mentioned a lot in Company of Heroes 1 and 2, moving an engineer off the front lines to the back to build the building, then go back to the front lines, it takes you out of the flow of the game a little bit. Adding an engineer squad to the HQ and making it almost work more like Command and Conquer really made me happy. Like, it just made so much sense that they would do that. You need a building, you have the money for the building, you tell the HQ to build the building, you're done.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's a huge improvement.
Nice little piece of polish there. I could not figure out. Now, I've only played like 2 skirmishes and maybe 2 missions in the campaign. I could not figure out if you could upgrade points anymore. I think more like Company of Heroes 1 than 2. There's a lot of fuel points on the map, and there's a lot of munitions points on the map, and there's some that kind of do both. Where in 2, most points gave you a little bit of both, and some, there was like 2, usually 1 or 2 dedicated fuel points, and then 1 or 2 dedicated munitions points. In the skirmishes, I saw a lot more dedicated points than kind of...
Yeah, they also
combo
vary.
points,
there's like +5 or +16, so there's like high, low, and medium resource points in Code 2.
But I couldn't see how to upgrade them or fortify them like you could in the other
cache,
games.
fuel cache. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I didn't see that either. The other thing that I liked was the breaching. I thought was cool, because there's always a little bit of an immersion breaker for Company of Heroes 2, where you have like your dudes standing outside the building, hiding behind a barrel, like shooting into the building.
Well, I played Soviets, so I would always just throw Molotov.
Yeah.
But
some
no,
people. Some people are annoyed about the breaching, because it's kind of video gamey, but I think garrison clearing is definitely a spot where Co can really get slowed down. Like when you have a squad in a building and you just can't get rid of it, it's just annoying. And so I like that idea.
The other
as long as
thing
it's
that I noticed,
balanced well, it sounds OP in theory, but
I don't know what you guys felt about this, but I was surprised to see how many squad types there were. I feel like in Company of Heroes 2, and I didn't play the first one very much. I honestly, playing 2, I kicked myself. I was like, I've really been sleeping on these World War II RTS games. But in Company of Heroes 2, there's like 3 squads per building. You get, your heavy tank building produces 3 different tanks. Your light tank building makes 3 different tanks, and then you've got 4 buildings, about 3 different squad types per building. In 3, I built the building and I'm like, oh, I've got all these new different squad types. I was just almost getting into it for the first time overwhelmed by it. I felt like there was more different squad types than there were in the older games. Did you guys notice that or feel that at all?
Happening. My impression was, so I played the skirmish and then I started playing the multiplayer and I just got bored really fast and I was like, I'll pass. It was really janky and messy, and I mean the skirmish AI was terrible, so I'll reserve judgment until I can play multiplayer. That's when I'm going to actually have opinions. It was a bit too messy for me. I really liked Ardennes Assault, so I think the direction of the campaign is the right direction. I hope maybe they don't overdo it, because Ardennes Assault was still pretty straightforward. I never really played Total War. I think for a bigger picture, I think I like the direction that they're not reinventing the wheel, and they're not adding in all these quirky, goofy, silly, obnoxious things that are excellent marketing material but are actually frustrating as hell. So Co 2, of course, the blizzards, the deep snow, like, wow, amazing General Winter, and then anyone who played Company of Heroes 2 twice thought, man, I really hate not being able to dodge grenades because I'm in the deep snow. So I definitely appreciate them. Just, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. And Company of Heroes 2 is, well, some people may say it's broken, but no, it's a very good game. It's very popular. They don't need to reinvent the wheel, so that's good. And there's a lot of nice additions. So even though they're not adding in all these like quirky, new, silly, goofy things, they're adding in things like side armor. Like, you mean that if I shoot a tank on the side, it has less armor than the front, but more than the rear? It's amazing. Because I feel like that's really where KOTOR tank battles get a bit simplified. You kind of just
had already thought the KOTOR did that, so I feel a little silly.
Nope, you get side armor. You get the armored skirts on your Panzer IV. It increases your frontal armor.
Yeah, no, I just for some reason I when I played KOTOR, I pictured an X on the vehicle. I just assumed like that there was a difference.
The rear
quarter,
quarter, the back quarter of the side is the rear armor. And so you can get really lucky if the tank is angled slightly, you can get a rear armor hit from the front.
It's just like half and half, like the front half.
No, it's not quite half. It's like a third or a quarter is the rear armor.
I didn't know that either. So, and I have like 1,000 hours of Company of Heroes too. So
yeah, but keep an eye. Like you may score like a really random rear armor hit, and you're like, wait, what?
I have noticed that you get like really random rear armor penetrations, but.
Yeah, so
thing they mentioned in... I'm sorry.
Go on.
One thing they mentioned in the preview that I haven't had a chance to play around with yet is they said that they'd expanded the true sight system to include verticality because of some of the steep Italian like villages that they're going to have. I have not seen that yet, but I'm very interested to see what they do with it, because one thing about Dawn of War 2 to 3 is, Dawn of War 2 had kind of that Company of Heroes tactical hiding behind stuff. And then you'd have a zoanthrope shoot its artillery and it hits a tiny little bump on the ground.
Yeah.
But I'm interested to see how verticality works both in the campaign and in multiplayer. And I wonder if that's not the thing that they get out of multiplayer maps.
Verticality is really bad in KOTOR because it just collides with like artillery, like a ISU, like some it just things on the high ground can like never be hit by certain units. It's really bad.
Yeah.
Same with the old Sturm Tiger.
Yeah.
I noticed in Company of Heroes 3, something was super frustrating is I did one of the missions, you have to like assassinate this general, and I had snipers. I had 2 snipers on the low ground, and there was like a set of stairs that like went up 3 different levels, and there was a squad of Volksgrens up there or something, and my snipers had line of sight, but they couldn't shoot them because of the elevation of the stairs, and that was super frustrating to me. Like I can see tactical reasons for having vertical line of sight, like to have vision on units. But I feel like if you see them, unless you're shooting through some sort of shot blocker, you should be able to like traverse up stairs. Even if I can't draw a perfect straight line from the like barrel of the rifle to the unit that I'm shooting, like please just let me clip through, like raycast it or whatever. Let me hit those dudes, because bouncing sniper shots off stairs was super frustrating when I saw that today.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. What I was gonna say for KOTOR 3, the first thing that struck me was the art style. I don't like it. It's like too colorful and bright, and I was like, what is this? And all of the art, like the poster, like it's very cartoony and colorful.
Okay.
And
the poster I don't like, but
it's terrible.
I absolutely am fine with the KOTOR 3 art style. Like some yellow buildings is not going to upset me. I don't need for realism, I don't need a big block of brown and gray. I think having some reds and greens is okay.
Well, it's not the
gonna...
colors of the world for me. It's just the lighting is just really bright. It's just if you compare it to Co, like especially Co 1. Co 1 was kind of grim and gritty, and then Co 2 was a bit more, like a little bit more cartoony, but it was still enough that it was fine. And then Co 3, it definitely, like, it struck me out, and I got a very bad, like, what does this look like?
Honestly, Co 3 looks almost exactly like Co 2 to me, and maybe they're just reusing Co 2 assets for some of it. But I mean, like, I was literally like side by siding screenshots I had taken in both games, and to me, the graphics look almost identical. I think there are some situations where there's more like the brights are a little brighter, but the models themselves look very similar to me.
Yeah, well, I don't mind about using the same assets. I just don't like the cartoony style, and the reason why it scares me as well is because what I don't like about the direction Co 2 has taken over the past few years with the community balance team is there's been a lot more like arcadey abilities and a lot more like immersion breaking kind of goofy contrived explosive profiles and stuff, things that just sort of take you out of that World War II immersion fantasy. You know, things like some airborne squad has this ability where when they start shooting at a squad, for whatever reason, the squad can only move at half speed. Or like with a railway artillery that uses the exact same explosive effect as the B4 howitzer, but has a kill radius that's like 5 times as large. And so when I see more arcadiness,
that seems like it's just an asset issue. Like, I absolutely agree that would be a problem. If the 2 explosions are the same size,
well, they didn't previously. It was a
area
balance
effect of
change.
the
Yeah, and so because so what's something good about Co 3 is that they're heavily working with the community, and they have been for a long time. And so they've actually hired some community map maker to make maps for them. I think that's really cool, because
for me, realism has never been a big part of why I play RTS. Like, some of my favorite RTS are Command and Conquer, StarCraft, the Warcraft games. Not a one of them is anywhere near realistic. So that's never really been an issue for me. I can definitely see readability problems, like 2 explosions looking exactly the same and one of them's 5 times more powerful. But as someone who's not involved in a World War II RTS for a World War II simulation, that doesn't even hit my radar personally.
Yeah. A lot of people are, though.
I can go from like Red Alert 3 where there's absolutely nothing realistic there going on in that game. And the movement profiles specifically is what I would look at in Company of Heroes 3. And I haven't played around with the tanks a lot. But yeah, I don't know. That's never really been on my radar. I think you said something about that in your video.
Yeah, I talk about this a lot in my video. Is that the art style should match the game, because people play games for different reasons, and no one playing Warcraft 3 is doing it because they want a World War II immersive experience, right? But people are playing Company of Heroes because a lot of people are playing it because they want that, and even someone who enjoys it purely for its game design, for its I think it's a very well-designed game. Still, the World War II like immersion fantasy is a part of its appeal, and so stepping away from that, I think, is to its detriment, and so I hope Co 3 doesn't do that too much with all these like arcadey kind of goofy abilities. Things like Mark Target, where for whatever reason this squad takes twice as much damage for 30 seconds. And those things have, there's been a lot of, I don't want to only kind of pick on the community balance team. Like there's been like stuff in Co 1 that's been like that forever. Like some slow ability that the like Panzer Grenadiers had. So there's always been a bit of that in Company of Heroes, but I think adding more of those things needs to be done carefully. they can't only think about balance. And also, like, the problem that I have too, or that I'm worried about, is that, you know, they have this big community council group of people, and I don't know who they are, but I feel like it's going to be made up of 1v1 players, you know, competitive players, and sort of like in Co 2, where it's gone over the last few years, things will be done in a way that is to the detriment of the 4 versus 4 experience, which is what the majority of people play in terms of multiplayer. Of course, most people play single player, but overemphasizing like this 1v1 balance in a way that can ruin the team game experience, can ruin the, you know, quote unquote realism. Like, I'm definitely not one of those neckbeards who want to be like, why can this Su-76 penetrate the Tiger? The Tiger has 105 millimeters of armor. It shouldn't be penetrated by a 76 millimeter. Like, okay, I don't care about like that realism.
Not at 800 meters. I mean, come on.
Whatever. I care about I care about the immersion fantasy, right? Like the sort of the suspension of disbelief is what I care about. I don't care about the realism, as it were.
My feeling, without like reading more and seeing if they've released any information about it, my impression is that they're going for a more cartoony / stylized style. I think it's just to draw in a wider audience of people. I feel like they're not going to make it feel more arcadey. That's just, again, with my initial impressions of the game and not having done a whole ton of research into it. I feel like it's more attractive to RTS players. And RTS as a genre is sort of on the decline, let's say. Like, we had our heyday before. That might be a controversial opinion as well, but my gut feeling tells me that they're going for this style to draw in more people. And I think you have a better chance at getting a larger mass market appeal if you go from a more gritty, like everything is gray, everything is destroyed, or brown, to a more vibrant, like much more colorful. And I think it's a nice choice to choose the Italian campaign as well, because it's so much different than what you typically see in World War II games, which is usually like the Western Front.
Yeah, they're doing Africa as well. Yeah, and I think
I was actually going to bring up. I was actually going to bring up Africa because I was going to say you're going to get your fill of browns and
the desert. That's right. Yeah,
where everything is going to be brown.
But at least the desert looks different than everything being like brown.
It's like an orangey kind of color.
The other thing I was going to say is, looking at Dawn of War 3 and Age of Empires 4 and also Company of Heroes 3, I think Relic may have changed their approach from, we want our game to like really, really, I hesitate to say cutting edge, but like, I feel like they're not pushing the visuals as hard in a technical way to make it easier on people's systems. Like, I saw this one guy, I wish I got the 20 minutes of my life back, complaining about Age of Empires 4, even after they had fixed some of the things that fans were complaining about.
Like the arrow sizes.
Or like the water physics, and I'm like, I don't know.
Who cares? Like, that's so crazy to get really upset about that.
But, I don't know, to me it's just not that kind of game. Like, I think one of the things he was comparing against was one of the Anno games, and it's like, Anno is a simulation. You're going to sit down and you're building a town, and Age of Empires is not that kind of game. It's a board game.
It's a historical abstraction, is what it is.
Right.
Which is why you have priests converting by saying Wallaloo and so forth.
Anyway, my point though was, I think they're specifically targeting a more mid-range computer. I think they're not trying to target the absolute top of the line machine so that more people's computers can run it.
Well, isn't it also just budget? Like, it's just to make things look better, it's expensive, and they probably don't have a big budget. Like, Co 1's budget would have been much higher, probably more than both Co 2 and Co 3 combined.
I don't know. I mean, like I said,
it was a very big budget.
Again, Company of Heroes 3, physically the models look very similar to 2. And 2 looked really good when it came out in 2013, 2014, whenever it was. So that same kind of level of graphical fidelity works on a lower level, not as high-end computer now. And I don't know, it feels intentional to me. Like, they're specifically targeting lower-end machines, which makes sense.
Well, it's the same reason why no game has been able to overtake Supreme Commander, is because even though it was in 2007, its budget was like 70 million, and
Jeez.
Was it really?
yeah, I think so. And it wasn't profitable on launch. I don't think Co 1 was either on launch. Maybe over time with the expansions that it paid off, but there's not going to be, another 70 million RTS game, and so it's hard to overtake those games.
I mean,
maybe StarCraft 2 was, but anyway, I think Italy was the right front. I know a lot of people were like, we should do Japan. That would have been a disaster, I think. The Pacific Theater.
I think I'm unfortunately kind of running out of time, but I'm gonna just put this out there because I want the internet to hear this for me. People who want ships and Company of Heroes are stupid. It's just a stupid request.
I don't know
sorry.
about wanting ships in the game, but like even if it was just only land combat, but to do Japan properly, you would have had to have like banzai charges and like booby traps and to do that would have been like really cheesy and gimmicky and frustrating and not fun at all. Like it would have just been, it would not have been fun.
I routinely hear people saying, "Why can't we add ships and do the Pacific Theater?" And it's how are you gonna fit a boat on the map?
Yeah. Well, I like like it'd be cool if you had like boats in the way that you have planes. They're just like a strike that you call in. You don't really see the boat. But I just think the land gameplay would not have worked. And
I never liked. Was it Red Alert?
Red Alert 3
games
had Navy, yeah.
Boat. Maybe Red Alert 3 had tons of
Red
boats.
Alert 3 is the only game where I have ever liked the naval aspect of it. Because the problem with naval combat is it cuts your map into chunks, and then these units can only be on this one chunk, and these units can only be on that one chunk, and it almost never works that well. But with Command & Conquer 3, those borders are so porous. You can build any building on the water and on the land, except for there's like the shipyard you can't build on the land, and a bunch of units can go out on the water, and it's just very seamless. And it's the only game I have ever really actually liked the naval combat. And honestly, even in that one, it's not my thing.
It's not too bad in Supreme Commander. You have a lot of like amphibious units and stuff.
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
like you have hover tanks, so it's a little bit more porous than most other games. But yeah, Red Alert 3 nails it really well. So we can wrap up soon. I think you said you have to go wayward. Co 3, I mean, I haven't really said a lot about it. I'm keeping my judgment open until I can play multiplayer. I think it's the right direction. We'll see how good it is, but I'm optimistic because of the community involvement and stuff. I've never been involved with it. I think working for a competitor at one point probably got me on some list that says conflict of interest. Yeah, I don't know. So hopefully it's good. I think it might be a hard sell for people because like Co 2 has really matured. Like convincing people to jump ship in the long term may be a challenge. It'll have to be good for that to happen. In a way that Co 2 kind of didn't have the challenge because its UI was so much better. Like you go back and play Co 1 now and you're like, oh, this UI is like real bad, and not having like True Sight is really obnoxious. You have this MG, they just see it through like a hedge, and you're like, oh man. Hopefully it's good. We'll see. I don't have any other thoughts. What do you guys think?
I like it. It feels mushy, I would say. So like when I play Co 2, and maybe this is a performance issue with Co 3, how it isn't like optimized yet, which of course, if it's in an alpha state, it's not optimized. But in Co 2, when I give orders to a unit, it feels really snappy. It feels super crisp. And I'm not even talking about the world map in Co 3. I mean, even in the skirmishes in Co 3, it feels a little mushy. Like there's I don't know if there's like some delay, or maybe my frame rate is dropping because it's not super optimized. It just feels a bit mushy. And if they can sort of tighten that up and then fix all the jankiness, I think it's going to be pretty good.
Yeah, the jankiness is why I did not like it at all. What I played with it was too janky.
I noticed something similar. To me, it seemed like sometimes it was not recognizing when I was hitting a key. Like I'd hit a hotkey and then issue an order, and the unit wouldn't do it. Or like the panning felt kind of like sticky, like it wanted to stick, and then it would start moving as I was trying to pan around. And I'm happy to attribute that at this point to the game being in pre-alpha. Um, but as far as like the tech tree goes and the maps and the changes to the actual gameplay, I'm happy. Like I was something else I haven't heard people talking about a lot is the upgrades. Like you have dedicated upgrade structures in Company of Heroes 3. So there's one structure that upgrades infantry and one for tanks, um, and again, there was kind of like a lot of them, and I was, I haven't had a chance to kind of go through them all, but it seemed like it was, they actually had, it wasn't like a +1 damage, that's not the sort of thing the Company of Heroes does. But like for the American upgrades, I think one of them reduced the upkeep cost of your infantry, and I was like, I wonder what kind of impact it's going to have on the game when I get that. So I do like having more structures, and I do like the dedicated upgrade buildings. I like the idea. I saw a Reddit post where the user was comparing and contrasting the way that the British and the U.S. forces upgraded their infantry and how they were different. I unfortunately don't remember it, or I'd go over it now. But as far as that goes, it actually feels good. And if they, and I assume it as when, because this is still pre-alpha, but if they manage to take where they are and get it polished to the level of Company of Heroes 2, I'd be really, really happy to play it like that.
Yeah, it definitely combines a lot of Co 1 and Co 2. It's been very deliberate. Oops. Bye, Brandon. Here he is. Oh.
I'm sorry about that. I dropped out there for a second. I went to mute myself and I hit disconnect. I do have to go soon though.
Okay.
But yeah, my brain is shutting down. I didn't get a lot of sleep last.
Yeah. I was just saying that Co 1 and Co 3 very much combines a lot of the Co 1 stuff, which I like, such as the resource type, the resource system. I think was better. The upgrades were better in Co 1. Co 2 doesn't really have any upgrades. You spend 15 fuel to get your weapon racks, and it's basically a no factor. Co 1 you had it was 60 fuel to get the bars, so more meaningful fuel upgrades I think is definitely a benefit. So we'll see. Okay.
So just real quick, super quick. I noticed an upgrade for the Americans on the infantry dedicated upgrade tree that was give a bar to every rifleman unit that you have on the board.
Yeah, that's Co 1.
So it's like a
it's global. Same as that. Yep.
So then they took it from Co 1. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, because it means you have to think about do I go for this light vehicle or do I get my bar upgrade? Is it you don't just get both?
Yeah. Or do I want to pump out one or two more rifleman squads so I can give them all bars at once?
Yeah.
I guess no. Once you have it upgraded, every subsequent one would have.
They do, yeah.
Never mind.
And they've deliberately tried to scale back the light vehicles and make it more infantry focused, which is good. Again, Co 2 light vehicles were too dominant. They would come in at 2 minutes. Be really obnoxious. And Co 1 there were less light vehicles, so it seems like a good hybrid.
That's something else that I was planning on bringing up. So one thing that it seems like they're working on is the relationship between infantry and vehicles. You were talking about 4v4, and one of the problems with balance, kind of a large scale thing, is it's very, very hard. I notice this a lot in a lot of RTS. It's very, very hard to weight different types of advantages against each other. So, like the German, their tanks tend to be heavier, and that's just in a 4v4. That's just a big advantage.
Yeah.
Like in a 1v1, the U.S. tanks are more maneuverable. They can get behind the German tanks, that sort of thing, and that becomes an interesting asymmetrical balance. But in a 4v4, if you've got 4 guys with king tigers, that's probably the end of the game. And I don't think it's ever really a fair thing to say, well, if you don't want that to happen, the balances don't let them do that. It's such a, I feel like I've seen that sort of thing happen in games before, that the way to beat the strategy is to not let the strategy happen in the first place. But if it happens, you lose. And one thing I've seen, I feel like in Company of Heroes 3, is tanks aren't as big of an HP sink as they are, and it can make them feel a little less satisfying to use maybe, but I think that might be a good trade-off, to have that whole kind of HP health bar conundrum rear its ugly head. So we'll have to keep an eye. I'm going to be keeping an eye on that in particular to see what they do with that, because some of those German HP sink tanks can feel bad to fight, especially in large team games.
I also don't like how the way that snares work in Company of Heroes 2. I think is not fun. Like every squad has a snare. It means diving, like flanking, is so risky that you basically just never do it. Because if you dive after something, you're just gonna get hit by a couple of Panzerfausts, and now your tank destroyer is like stranded with a crippled engine. And Co 1 didn't have snares for Axis, and so you could actually flank tanks in a really aggressive way. And it just feels bad when your heavy Tiger tank is running for its dear life away from a squad of conscripts, because like the conscript squad can slow down your tank. And I think snares are in, by the way, that like from what I've seen of it. So I hope that they reconsider the way that snares work. Anyway, let's wrap up. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Everyone's Twitter handle, you can see them if you want to follow these cool RTS dudes. Thanks for watching. Hopefully it won't be another 6 months until the next time, but it always happens to be like that, so we'll see.
Every time I'm on these podcasts, I feel like that, I'm not a big like Always Sunny in Philadelphia guy, but I just remember the meme with the guy in front of the crazy pin board, like going like this. I feel like that every time I talk about RTS games. Just,
Pepe Salvia.
anyway. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks,
All right.
and catch you later.